I just wanted to go over today briefly Plato's Republic, and specifically in Plato's Republic, the cave allegory, which is probably one of the most famous analogies ever, in philosophical history, if you really think about it. And I was given this as a recommendation for content from Savoring the Sage, and that's another content producer. He produces a lot of good content. I encourage you to check him out for yourself on both YouTube and Instagram at Savoring the Sage. A lot of good stuff there, a lot of good wisdom that he posts, daily from my understanding. So Plato's Republic specifically, the entire book is essentially trying to draw an ideal government. Okay, what it is that we as a society should strive for as far as the ideal government, the perfect government, the one that allows for as much individual liberties as possible, but also at the same time the most virtue as possible. In order to have virtue, there have to also be laws, to goad those who are less virtuous into being virtuous. And just really, really brief, to summarize the whole book, it's the idea of it's the job, the duty of the lawmakers, to push society into being more virtuous, right? Even if people don't understand why they need to be virtuous, it's the duty of the lawgivers, to make society more virtuous, just given their position. Things he goes into kind of Earth's development history as well. He talks about the cycles of government, how freedom and tyranny are kind of in this cyclical relationship where out of tyranny comes more freedom, generally speaking. But tyrants, if there's too much freedom, those tyrants can use that individual freedom to take control, right? So it's kind of a figure eight kind of loop that societies experience out of tyranny and freedom. They work into and out of one another, right? Now, as far as the cave allegory goes, it's a very deep allegory, right? He draws the picture of men essentially being chained inside of a cave. They can't even move their heads to side to see the person next to them. All they can see on the back of the cave are shadows moving to and fro, right? And lights and sounds coming from behind them, which behind them is essentially the opening of the cave, which is above and behind them, right? And so light and shadows refract into the cave from behind them. And essentially these people have been stuck in this cave their entire life, so they don't have any context of the outside world. All they can do is come to conclusions of what they see in the cave, which are simply just the shadows and just the sounds. And these individuals essentially come to their own conclusions and opinions on what those shadows and sounds could possibly be. And they develop their own beliefs, their own systems of knowledge that they essentially gain from their constant observation of these shadows. Someone then comes down to the cave and releases one of them, unchains them and says, let's go to the top, let's go to the surface. So the men slowly go up the hill, up to the entrance of the cave. And the man that's been stuck in the bottom of the cave is suddenly blinded by this brilliant light. And he can't see anything around him. He can't see the sources of the shapes. He can't see the sources of the noise. All he can do is hear with his ears, and it's super confusing for him. And as his eyesight adjusts to the brilliancy of the light, he realizes all this light, all of this noise, all of these shapes came from these people walking back and forth at the top of this cave, and the shapes, were simply their shadows projecting onto the wall, right? And he looks up, and it was the sun. The brilliance of the sun was the source of the light in the cave. Suddenly, he goes back down to the bottom of the cave, and he doesn't want to, right? The man, compels him to go back to the bottom of the cave, and the gentleman doesn't want to. He wants to stay at the surface because he sees all of this real truth of what he has been misunderstanding his entire life. He doesn't want to go to the bottom of the cave, but he's forced to, right? And as he's going to the bottom of the cave, he's suddenly blinded again because he can't see in the darkness of the cave because his eyes had adjusted to the light. And as he's blinded, he's trying to describe to his friends down at the bottom of the cave what he's seen, okay? And the people at the bottom of the cave, still strapped and looking at the wall, they think he's insane, to the point to where they all talk amongst themselves and say, if the man comes back down to release our friend who's talking this insanity, we're going to kill him. Okay, so that analogy has so much depth to it, okay, so much to dissect. It's insane, okay? There's a lot of different moving pieces there. The overarching concept is in the context of Republic itself is essentially to illustrate the knowledge, the level of knowledge needed to achieve that perfect society. In order to achieve the perfect government that Plato idealizes in this dialogue, it would come to the equivalent of somebody coming from the bottom of the cave to the top of the surface, when witnessing the sunlight for the first time, and coming to the truth of that level of the truth of what reality of nature even is. However, there's a lot of different things to dissect here, which I find interesting. Obviously the bottom of the cave where you're strapped in and chained in and looking at one-dimensional structure of a wall essentially is an analogy of kind of where our basis of knowledge is for many people. For many of us, we're chained in our cultures, we're chained in our religions, we're chained in our opinions, and we can't see beyond them. We can't see beyond the shadows of the opinions we've come to from these cultural limitations we've been placed in. And for many of us, we stay there. We stay chained to our own opinions. We stay chained to our own context of our own beliefs. And we're unwilling to move. We're unwilling to hear out the person next to us. We're unwilling to see their point of view. And we're certainly scared of and unwilling to go to the surface to attain more knowledge. For those of us who are willing to go to the top, to look at point of views outside of what we're taught, right? To go to the surface and experience the sunlight for the first time, the blinding sunlight of other perspectives and other beliefs and the truth of wisdom, right? When we go back to the bottom of the cave, when we go back and try to tell our friends, right? For many of us, we are told that we are crazy. We are told we're crazy. We're told that, that knowledge is not worth having. That knowledge of beyond our opinions and beyond our initial beliefs is dangerous, and that those who teach such things should actually be put to death. And that was certainly the case for many spiritual teachers in past history. You have examples of Socrates teaching virtue and wisdom to the people of Greece and then them putting them to death through hemlock, right? And then you have stories of Jesus being put to death on the cross for what he taught of living righteously and loving your neighbor as yourself. So the allegory of the cave is pretty deep. There's a lot more to go into it, than a 10-minute, 15-minute video would allow. But that's essentially the gist of more or less the depth of that analogy, right? So he talks about how there's 4 phases to understanding, right? So you have your initial opinions, you have your initial beliefs, which are like looking at the shadow of the cave, okay? And nothing beyond it, right? You can't even see your own neighbor, right? You're so focused on the shadows and the falsehoods of what you actually believe there, considering the context of what's actually going on at the top of the cave, right? And then you have your faith, right? What you believe in. Things that are based on understanding and knowledge, which is that 3rd phase, but that are still very limited and can even fall victim to superstition and incorrect opinions. After that point, as you get further up the cave, right, you get to what Plato terms as understanding, okay, which is intellectual knowledge, which is academic knowledge, which is contextual knowledge of what the faith actually means and what your opinions actually are, and learning to actually think outside of that, right? But Plato stops there and he says, this isn't the furthest you need to go. You need to go all the way to the top. The end goal of philosophy and knowledge should be to attain the height of wisdom, to understand the divine, right? What he calls the intelligible realm, where the divine comes from. That is where our focus should be as a society, the first cause of all things. That should be the end goal of our pursuit of knowledge, right? And then from that point, once we reach that point, Plato says that we need to be willing to go back to the bottom of the cave to teach others those principles, to teach them wisdom, to teach them virtue, to teach them justice, right? To teach them fairness and loving our neighbors and loving society, and then also do our best to legislate accordingly, to push people towards the top of the cave, towards ultimate knowledge and understanding. Plato understood that we came from somewhere. It wasn't just all put here by chance. He understood that out of chaos come order, right? And there was a first cause to that. So it was important to not only look for it ourselves, not only come to an understanding of wisdom, but it was our responsibility, our duty to teach others these things. And he said, unfortunately, most of these people pursue wisdom and attain it, right? And get to the top of the cave and look around and be like, oh man, what I believed previously was a complete and utter sham and a lie. This is the truth of things, right? The people at the top of the cave, they are very hesitant. They don't want to because they see the shallowness of what's below them, right? And then he brings it back to reality, and he said all the people in the courts and fighting back and forth amongst differences of opinion and religion, you know, and that kind of thing, and the business pursuits and all these things. In fact, that is the shallowness of life. That's the things that people think that matter, right? Pleasure, success, all these things that society thinks that matters, but in effect, it's just simply working of the knowledge of the shadows on the wall. And then he says that people with wisdom are usually put down or put to death, one of the two, or shut down somehow. And so most of the time people don't even find out what it is they had to say to begin with because they're silenced. But he said for those who have attained wisdom, it's their duty to enlighten others as much as possible. That's their duty. And then in fact, if those people who have attained wisdom refuse to govern, they themselves end up becoming governed by those who simply only understand the shadows at the bottom of the cave. He said he wishes that if there was a way to compel the wise to be the leaders of society, because if they could lead society, they would bring society to an age of enlightenment, so to speak, to a golden age where everything is fair, everything is pushing towards virtue and what, you know, the divine's plan is for humanity. Another aspect of that analogy is the walk from the bottom of the cave to the top. That could be viewed as a personal development cycle, right? Or even societal development, where we each realize that our own personal opinions are limited, our own restrictions are limited. And so we need to attain wisdom. And so as we journey to that discovery, to the blinding light of the sun, so to speak, where initially we can't understand it, that is essentially a depiction of a personal discovery of wisdom, and you know, even what society comes to. And then when you go back down to the bottom of the cave, you realize, man, I don't understand any of this anymore. And I think those who have searched for wisdom could probably identify with this. When you reach more attainment, more knowledge, more wisdom, you go back to your friends and family and relatives, and you realize, man, I just don't understand this perspective anymore, right? I don't believe this anymore. So, I mean, what am I supposed to say here? You know, it's one of those things where, you know, you can easily, if you've experienced this, you can easily identify with the allegory. You know, so those are just some perspectives from Plato's Republic I found interesting. You know, probably one of the deepest allegories I've ever read in any philosophical work in my life. You know, if anybody knows of any deeper allegories that are comparable or deeper than that, please let me know. I would be curious to read it. Analogies in philosophy are very powerful tools to get messages across. And if you read philosophy, you'll notice most of the philosophers, they do their best to come up with good analogies, because some of these concepts they try to communicate and convey to people, you can't just say through direct words. You have to use mental depictions to get the idea across. You know, so as Plato said, it's important for us to learn that we don't really know anything, right? That our own personal opinions are not really knowledge. And true knowledge is actually wisdom, understanding what this is actually all about, what life really means, what the purpose of life is. Not just intellectual knowledge of business or law or politics, right? It's actual wisdom of what our relations are with humanity and the world as a whole. You know, and the allegory is actually located in Republic Book 7. So if you want to read it for yourself and come to your own conclusions, I you know, highly recommend that you do that. You know, again, one of the deepest allegories. I could go on all day about it, but for the sake of brevity and not making this video half an hour, you know, I'll stop right here. But, you know, I encourage everybody to pick up philosophy for themselves. It's very important, especially in today's day and age. You know, of all the different chaos that you see around you, it's good to have perspective of others' opinions, okay? Especially in religion, especially in politics, you know, cultures. It's good to understand the other side that, you know, that you're divided against. And it's important to understand that loving one's neighbor is probably the most important thing that you could learn in this life as far as the wisdom goes, right? And we're here to love others, to help others, not to fight others. And so I appreciate you tuning in. I hope that was enlightening and somewhat inspiring. If you have any more questions on this, let me know in the comments below, and I'll be happy to, make some more content on it to kind of clarify further, or, make something on the individual topic itself. So, I appreciate everybody tuning in and listening to me ramble on about philosophy, but, it's something I'm passionate about. So subscribe, follow, like, follow me on Instagram at The Angry Philosopher, and, I'll see you around.